did they not stream for the exits? Why did they not withdraw from the UN? But then why is the Universal Declaration and the whole body of human rights law that followed it the object of so much attack now? Not only from the violent extremists like the Takfiris, but also from authoritarian leaders, populists, demagogues, cultural relativists, some Western academics, and even some UN officials. I have spent most of my career at and in the UN. What I have learned is this: the UN is symptomatic of the wider global picture. It is only as great or as pathetic as the prevailing state of the international scene at the time. I also have come to understand how weak human memory is, that to many people history matters only insofar as it can be unsheathed and flung into political battle. They do not view it as a service to deeper human understanding. There is a dangerous remove and superficiality to so many of our discussions, so much so that the deepest core issue seems to have been lost on many. Is it not the case, for example, that historically the most destructive force to imperil the world has been chauvinistic nationalism, when raised to feral extremes by self-serving, callous leaders and amplified by mass ideologies which themselves repress freedom? The UN was conceived in order to prevent its rebirth. Chauvinistic nationalism is the polar opposite of the UN, its very antonym and enemy. So why are we so submissive to its return? Why are we in the UN so silent? The UN's raison d'etre is the protection of peace, rights, justice, and social progress. Its operating principle is therefore equally clear: only by pursuing the opposite to nationalism, only when states all work for each other, for everyone, for all people, for the human rights of all people, can peace be attainable. Why are we not doing this? Those of us in the UN Secretariat, originating from all 193 member states, work collaboratively, and we do not answer to any state. In contrast, too many governments represented at the UN will often pull in the opposing direction, feigning a commitment to the common effort, yet fighting for nothing more than their thinly thought interests, taking out as much as they can from the UN politically, while not investing in making it a true success. The more pronounced their sense of self-importance, the more they glory in nationalism, the more unvarnished is the assault by these governments on the overall common good, on universal rights, on universal law, and universal institutions such as this one. And as the attack on the multilateral system and its rules, including most especially international human rights law, intensifies, so too will the risk increase of further mischief on a grander scale. The UN's collective voice must therefore be principled and strong, not weak and whining, obsessed with endless wrangling over process, the small things, as it is the case today. If my office, and of which I am very proud, and I have gotten one thing right over the last few years, it is our understanding that only fearlessness is adequate to our task at this point in time, not ducking for cover or using excuses or resorting to euphemisms, but a fearlessness approaching that shown by human rights defenders around the world. For only by speaking out can we begin to combat the growing menace of chauvinistic nationalism that stalks our future. I appeal to you to do more, to speak louder and work harder for the common purpose and for universal human rights law to better our chances for a global peace. This Council session will consider numerous essential issues. Among them, you have before you the report of my office on Kashmir and the coming report on Venezuela. You will also be informed of the findings of the team of experts on the Kasai regions of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And as I transition out of my position, the office will continue its work on the database of business enterprises engaged in specific activities related to Israeli settlements, as called for by the Council, with an update possibly before September. At the September session, the fact-finding mission report on Myanmar will be presented to the Council alongside the report of the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar. And you will also receive the report on Yemen prepared by the eminent international experts. In that context, I emphasize my grave worry regarding the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition's ongoing attacks in Hodeidah, which could result in enormous civilian casualties and have a disastrous impact on life-saving humanitarian aid to millions of people, which comes through the port. Mr. President, twice in the course of my mandate, I have reported on the troubling failure by a number of countries to grant access, and I will do so again today. These refusals of access constitute a serious affront to our work, and where there is sustained denial of access and serious reasons to believe violations are occurring, we will consider the option of remote monitoring. The office's mandate to conduct such monitoring is unassailable, and if the government concerned fears there may be inaccuracies, it should permit us in to see the situation on the ground. Mr. President, in Syria, the leadership's contempt and disregard for human rights was what laid the ground for this conflict and fueled it for the first year at least. The horrific violations and abuses committed since then, principally by the government and its allies, but including also the violent extremists and their supporters, have destroyed much of the country along with many of its people. Both my office and the Council's Commission of Inquiry have been refused access to all regions. The government's recent selective acceptance of one rapporteur's visit, when so many other requests have been outstanding for an extended period, is in no way an adequate stand-in for compliance with this Council's resolutions S18-1 and 19/22, which call for full cooperation with my office and the establishment of a field presence. Our extensive remote monitoring of human rights violations in Syria will continue. In Myanmar, as the Council is aware, there are clear indications of well-organized, widespread and systematic attacks continuing to target the Rohingya in Rakhine State as an ethnic group, amounting possibly to acts of genocide if so established by a court of law. In Kachin and northern Shan states, conflict has again escalated since October last year, and long-standing and widely reported human rights violations in the country include allegations of extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture and inhuman treatment, rape and other forms of sexual violence, forced labor, recruitment of children into armed forces, and indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks arising from conflicts between security forces and armed groups. Although Myanmar has stated that it will investigate allegations and prosecute alleged perpetrators, its actions to date have not met minimal standards of credibility or impartiality. Due to continuing refusals to permit access, OHCHR, the country special rapporteur, and the fact-finding mission have conducted remote monitoring. In the context of the MOU that the government of Myanmar has established with UNDP and UNHCR for the repatriation of Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh, I reiterate that no repatriation should occur in the absence of sustained human rights monitoring on the ground in the areas concerned. Given the gravity and scope of the human rights violations in Venezuela and continuing denial of access to my office, we will continue remote monitoring and reporting, and our second report will be published in the coming days. And we firmly believe the Council needs to establish a commission of inquiry. Since last June, the government has issued 3 invitations to special procedures, the first since 1996. However, the authorities have ignored a long list of requests by others whose mandates are particularly relevant to the current human rights crisis in the country. Despite Burundi's agreement to cooperate with the team of experts mandated by the Council last year, the team was expelled from the country last month and has not been able to return. Access is also denied to the International Commission of Inquiry set up in 2016, and the authorities have refused to finalize discussions on the renewal of the MOU with my office. Meanwhile, the human rights situation continues to deteriorate throughout the country. The government's continuing restrictions on civic space and its decision to revise the constitution through a referendum last month have generated a host of human rights concerns, including at least 44 alleged cases of arbitrary arrest and detention, and may further deepen grievances. I strongly encourage the government to re-establish engagement with all international human rights bodies. I have sought to engage substantively with both India and Pakistan over the past 2 years regarding the situation in Kashmir on both sides of the line of control. Refusals by both India and Pakistan to enable unconditional access have led us to conduct remote monitoring, with the first report issued last week. I encourage the Council to consider establishing a commission of inquiry for a more comprehensive investigation of the human rights situation in Kashmir and reiterate my calls for access. I am tremendously saddened by the assassination last week of Shujaat Bukhari, a courageous human rights defender, actively working for peace, including through his participation in the Track 2 diplomacy, seeking to help both India and Pakistan put an end to the violence. In Nicaragua, anti-government protests over the past 2 months have led to the killing of at least 178 people, almost entirely at the hand of the police forces and by armed pro-government groups, including allegedly the use of snipers, with at least 1,500 people wounded. This in addition to reported abductions and disappearances. I deplore the violence, including the horrific arson attack 2 days ago. The gravity of these developments may well merit an international commission of inquiry. I expect the commitments made at the resumption of the national dialogue on the 15th of June to be upheld, including the cessation of all forms of violence and threats thereof, and the commitment to extend an urgent invitation to OHCHR to visit the country, as we have repeatedly requested. This invitation should be sent without delay. In the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, remote monitoring by my office has found little change in the country's long-standing, grave and systematic violations of human rights. The people of the DPRK risk their lives and their dignity for the exercise of their fundamental human rights, including seeking to leave the country and communicating with individuals abroad. While I regret the persistent lack of cooperation with the country mandate holder, the DPRK's recent engagement with the human rights mechanisms through one special rapporteur visit and treaty body reviews is encouraging. I call on the authorities to step up that engagement significantly and without selectivity,